Good afternoon, everyone. It's just 1 minute past 3, and we're going to get started because we have a very, very hefty webinar for you on this New Year's week activity. So, of course, first, let's just start with those reminders about our webinar etiquette. As you know, your line is muted, but that doesn't mean that we do not want to hear from you. So please feel free to use the chat box and type in your question or comment. Or if you'd like to share a comment or ask a question over your phone line, you can just raise your hand using the icon that you'll see at the toolbar at the top of your screen. We'd also like to make sure that each of you has had an opportunity to type into the chat box the name of your parent center, the state where it's located if it's not in the name, and also if you could type in your email address. We are working with an evaluator who's really putting together, really very robust evaluation for all of our activities, and we will use your email address for him to reach out to you with a survey about this webinar. So as I said, today we have a lot of information to share with you, and it is about the Every Student Succeeds Act, and with today two special focuses. First, the focus is on the assessment of students with disabilities. And we have Cheryl Lazarus from the National Center on Educational Outcomes who will be sharing some information with us on that area. And then also Candice Cordiella, our partners at the Advocacy Institute, will be giving you a tour of the Stakeholders Guide for ESSA implementation that she has been working on with us and for us, and we're really excited about introducing that to you today. The goal for our webinar is to make sure that you as a parent center have the information, the skills, the knowledge, and also the inspiration in order to be that voice and to be advocates for our students with disabilities. And today our focus is especially on being that voice in your state as your state is developing its plan and implementing the new federal education law, ESSA. So our agenda for the call today is welcome and introduction from me. Hello, this is Deborah Jennings, and Happy New Year to everyone. And then we will have a discussion from Cheryl Lazarus. And Cheryl is the Assistant Director at the National Center on Educational Outcomes that's located at the University of Minnesota. After Cheryl's presentation, we'll have a little bit of time for your questions and comments. And then Candice Cordiella is going to present to you our stakeholder guide to ESSA. We will have another opportunity for questions and comments, and then we'd like to really have some discussion about how you and your parent center are involved in your state's ESSA plan development. And then last but definitely not least, we'll give you a tour of the ESSA resources that are available on the Hub, and also some soon to be posted on the Hub resources. So with that, I'm going to ask Cheryl to take it away, and we'll hear from her on the state assessments. Hi, Cheryl.
Hi.
Thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm always so happy to talk with other technical assistance centers that are funded by OSAP, and all the work that you are doing with parents is just so important. Let me tell you a little bit about the center I'm at, the National Center on Educational Outcomes, NCEO. We are funded by OSIP to provide technical assistance on issues related to the inclusion of students with disabilities in assessments. This work includes English language learners with disabilities. Now, there's been things have changed so much over the years, and thinking back, and you could go even further back in history, but thinking back to the 1960s, which that's years and years and years ago, though I guess it shows my age, but I can remember back then that many students with disabilities were not even included in the educational system, in the schools. And over the years, there have been various laws. The first version of the Elementary Secondary Education Act was in 1965. We've had IDEA, various assessment requirements over the years. Looking at in 2001, that was when No Child Left Behind came in. That was a reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. And that was the time when all of the accountability requirements really started to come into play, and including all students, including students with disabilities. In more recent years, we've had the Race to the Top assessments, which led to some changes, results-driven accountability, and then what I'm really here to talk about today, which is ESSA, which is the most recent reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. In regards to assessments, there's definitely some changes, and it's really important, and I'm looking forward to telling you about them, but there's also a lot that really hasn't changed that much since No Child Left Behind. So let's dive into this, and we'll talk a little bit about, what's the same and where are those things that are different. The Every Student Succeeds Act, which is ESSA, was passed a little more than a year ago, December 2015, and it goes into effect for the upcoming school year, 2017-18. And there is less federal control in this version than what there was under No Child Left Behind, more state flexibility. However, the state assessment requirement was retained, so there's really a lot that's still the same within the realm of assessments. Now, both ESSA as well as IDEA require that students with disabilities be included in both state and district assessments, and that includes lots and lots of assessments, from ones that are at the school, the district level, interim assessments, benchmark assessments, but what I really want to focus in today are on the summative assessments, those state tests that are used for accountability purposes. And so, so just know that there are requirements for the other tests and assessments, but what we're going to spend our time today is on the state tests. Now, there are requirements that all students, and this includes students with disabilities, are to be tested in grades 3 through 8 annually, and once in high school for math and reading or English language arts. In science, an assessment must be administered 3 times and once in each of the grade bands, once in grades 3 to 5, once in grades 3 to 6, and then once at the high school level. As I just mentioned, these assessments are in the 3 content areas: math, reading, English language, reading and English language arts, and science. And for those students with disabilities who are also English learners, they are required to participate both in the content assessments as well as in the English language proficiency tests. Now the participation requirements, and there's lots and lots of detail about participation requirements in ESSA, and all students who attend public schools are to participate, and this includes students in charter schools and other placements that are made by the school district. If a school falls below 95% participation, non-participants must be counted as non-proficient, and the requirement of 95% includes both all students as well as each of the subgroups separately. So at least 95% of the students with disabilities must participate. And this requirement has not changed since No Child Left Behind. One of the things that has arisen some in recent years is, more parents are choosing to opt out of the state test. This can be really problematic because it enables schools to really escape accountability for some students, and when schools aren't accountable, they may have less interest in really focusing in on ensuring high quality instruction. The assessment, most students with disabilities will participate in the general assessment with or without the use of accommodations. And then there's a few who participate in alternate assessments. More technically, they're called alternate assessments based on alternate achievement standards. And that can be up to 1% of the total tested population in each of the content areas. And I'll loop back to that and talk a little bit more about alternate assessments a little bit later in this presentation. And maybe as we talk about this, all students have to be assessed based on grade level standards, but let's step back from that and talk about instruction. And there are, requirements. It's just good practice that all students must have access to grade level content. And some students with disabilities may need to use instructional supports, various accessibility features, accommodations to access instruction, as well as those assessments, but that access is so key. And it should be noted that students with the most significant cognitive disabilities, those who participate in the alternate assessments, also must have the opportunity to learn that same standards-based content, though it's at a reduced depth, breadth, and complexity. Now, talking a little bit about accommodations, and accommodations are addressed in ESSA, and let's talk a little bit about the definition of what is an accommodation. Accommodations are changes in processes or procedures that enable students to more meaningfully access instruction and assessments. And the law requires that students with disabilities, as well as English learners, be provided with appropriate accommodations. For students with disabilities, the IEP team makes the accommodations decisions. Students who use an accommodation on the state test must have been provided with that accommodation during instruction, as well as on classroom district assessments, though it's important to note that some accommodations that might be very appropriate to use during instruction may not be appropriate to use on the state test. That what's the state test, there are policies which indicate which accommodations are appropriate to use on those assessments, and they're based on what those tests are measuring, and what, and to use maybe the more technical term, what's the construct of interest, but what are they measuring, And so there are, some accommodations for instruction just aren't appropriate to use on the assessments. Now I'm going to step back even further at this point, and the primary purpose of this presentation is to tell you what's in ESSA. But when I'm talking about accommodations, there's so much happening within the realm of accommodations that I need to step back and talk about just how there's been a real shift in the thinking about what accommodations mean. This has really come out of the shift to technology-based tests, and as part of the race to the top assessments, number of states joined together into consortia to develop some new technology-based tests. For example, for the general assessment, number of states are members of either PARC or Smarter Balanced. For the alternate assessments, there's DLM and MSAA, and with the ELP assessment, there's ELPA 21. But with these, and other states, even those that are not in consortia, also have really shifted to this new thinking, and there's a lot more focus on that it's important to meet the needs of all students, not just, and not thinking about accessibility and accommodations just for students with disabilities or English learners, and that it's really important to be thinking about just a universal design approach for all students. Now, when they shifted to these technology-based assessments, they took a new tiered approach to accessibility and accommodations. And there's a little bit of variation in the exact terminology from state to state, from consortia to consortia, but basically many of them have a three-tiered system where there are universal features, which are accessibility supports that are available to any student as part of the technology platform. An example of this might be ability to adjust the font size. That traditionally, that was a accommodation with perhaps a large print edition test booklet, but now, many assessments allow any student to adjust the font size, or highlighting as another item that once was an accommodation but now generally is a universal feature. Then there's a second tier, which are designated features, and these are accessibility supports that is available to any student, but the need has to be indicated by the adult or team, by the teacher, or I think I have the typo there, by the teacher or a team of adults, the IEP team for students with disabilities, and these designated features are things that are turned on. Not all kids have access to them, but kids that need them, they are turned on for those students. And then there's the third tier, which are accommodations, which are those accessibility supports that are available only to students with disabilities or English learners. I have a link to a resource here of a YouTube video where if you're interested in learning more about this paradigm shift, you can click on that. Now, I want to talk a little bit about alternate assessments based on alternate achievement standards. The alternate assessments are for the students with the most significant cognitive disabilities. There's alternate achievement standards that some states have that define how well students need to perform to be proficient on these assessments. One thing that has been a lot of talk about with ESSA, and that is that the federal government does not define who the students are, who are the students with the most, who are the students that have the most significant cognitive disabilities. And according to the regulations, each state is tasked with providing a definition of who those students are, and then the states must develop guidelines for IEP teams on the state's definition. There is, however, at the state level, a 1% cap on participation. This is a change from No Child Left Behind. With No Child Left Behind, No Child Left Behind allowed up to 1% of the students to be deemed proficient on the alternate assessments, but there was not a cap on participation. But now there's going to be the cap on participation, so really important to be part of, be involved in, stay aware of what's happening as your state is working to develop these definitions and develop guidelines on what's happening there. Back in No Child Left Behind, and they came in at kind of different periods, but there were a couple other alternate assessments that were allowed, one on modified achievement standards, another on grade level standards. Those other alternate assessments are no longer allowed under ESSA. Now, it's always, I don't know, kind of important to really think about the education of this population of students, the students with the most significant cognitive disabilities. And alternate assessments were required going back as far as IDEA 1997, and that law required the development of alternate assessments by 2000 for students who were unable to participate in the regular assessments. The term, they were first listed in 2003, and then as I talked before about just the difference in what the 1% cap means across No Child Left Behind and ESSA. There have been some just groundswell of change in how and where students with the most significant cognitive disabilities are instructed. They have much more access to academic instruction in the years since the requirements that they be included in assessment systems. Since a number of states are really grappling with that change to putting a cap on the participation at 1%, because before, as I said, it could be higher than the 1% could participate. And so here's just a little figure. There's bars or columns for each of the 50 states, and back in 2013-14, as you can see, there's one state that more than 2% of their students participate in the alternate assessment, and so that state definitely is going to need to get it down. There's a number of states that had significantly more than 1% of their students participating in the alternate assessment, but that said, there's other states that had fewer than 1%. So there's definitely a lot of variation there across states. Another way to look at it, and this is of the same year, 2013-14, and this one is looking at the the participation in grade H reading assessments, and it's kind of, I know you can't read all of the legends very well, but what it's showing is kind of student participation in across all assessments. And the bottom part of the stack bar, the dark blue line, is the participation rate in the regular assessment. The medium blue is participation in the alternate assessment based on alternate achievement standards, and then some of the states back then also had those other alternates that are no longer allowed. But as you can see, there's huge variation from one state to another in that year in the percentage of students with disabilities that were participating in states' regular assessments. And even if you are just looking at the two bars with the two parts of the stack bars in those states that don't have any of those extra alternates, you can still see that there's a lot of variation in both total participation as well as participation in the alternate assessment. Now I'm going to shift a little bit to talk just a bit about reporting requirements. For public reporting as well as reporting to the federal government, but for public reporting, all indicators, participation, proficiency, I'll have proficiency in there twice, but that must be reported by subgroup, including the students with disabilities subgroup. This includes the IDEA eligible only, and this ensures that the achievement gaps between students with disabilities and those without won't be hidden, and that the instructional needs of students with disabilities will be addressed in school improvement plans. NCEO for a number of years has done a report that really tracks what public reporting is taking place for the students with disabilities subgroup, and the reporting is of better and lower variation across states. Some states do a very nice job of reporting for proficiency participation for all subgroups, whereas other states make it very hard to find this information, that they may be hiding it somewhere for the special education subgroup, somewhere different than where they're reporting it on their main assessment pages. So there's just variations in the quality of how that's reported across states. Now, we've learned an awful lot over the years about the inclusion of students with disabilities in assessments, and I wanted to direct you to two resources which I think you were given links to that NCEO published about a year ago. One of these publications is Lessons Learned about Instruction from the Inclusion of Students with Disabilities in the new College and Career Ready Assessments, those assessments that the consortia of states developed. And the other one is a companion piece aimed at what we learned about assessment from the inclusion of students with disabilities in those new technology-based assessments. And these documents are, easy to read. There are lots of charts and tables that have lots of suggestions. They're aimed at technical assistance providers and really what kind of technical assistance might be needed to make sure that kids with disabilities are really getting the kinds of instruction that they need so that they're prepared for these new rigorous assessments, as well as what technical assistance might be needed and could be provided related to these assessments. Now, another some fact sheets that I really quickly want to highlight is that SIPR has some fact sheets that will be coming out really soon, and I'm sure they'll send you information about it as soon as they come out, but they're going to have some really good resources that are going to be available very soon on assessments and as well as alternate assessments, so you can be looking for those. Now, I'm not sure if we have time for questions at this point or not, but either I'd be happy to take a few right now, or we can go on.
So we have a question in the chat box, but I believe that's for the next part of our of the presentations. Are there any questions on Cheryl's information? I'm really excited about the resources on including students with disabilities in these new consortia assessments. Those are really going to be great as part of our conversations in our state, and talking about what needs to happen and making sure that some of those recommendations are actually included in the state's plan and also their plan for supporting schools. So I'm really excited about that, Cheryl. Does anyone have any questions? Any other questions? Well, don't feel as if you have to have your questions for Cheryl right now. Cheryl, you're going to be able to hang around with us for the balance of the webinar. So if you have questions later, feel free to post them or to raise your hand. And also, Cheryl's information, you can contact her directly at the University of Minnesota, and feel free to reach out to her. They are a center that is funded by the U.S. Department of Education, and so are really interested in making sure that they hear from us as parent centers and as parents if we have questions or need further information. So next I'm going to introduce Candace Cordiella, and Candace is the director of the Advocacy Institute. And we here at the Center for Parent Information and Resources are working very closely with Candace on developing the resources around the Every Student Succeeds Act. And so our first major resource is our Stakeholders Guide, which is available for you on parentcenterhub.org. And Candace will talk to you about how the guide is organized. And if you look on your screen in the bottom right-hand corner, it says File 34. And you can, right now, you can download a guide to the guide, as well as you can download the full PowerPoint presentation deck for this webinar. So Candace, I'm going to let you take it from here.
Okay, thank you. So as Deborah indicated, we've just developed, this is one in several pieces of information that we're honored to be involved with SIPR in developing on the new Every Student Succeeds Act, and I'm thrilled that SIPR has taken this on in a timely manner so that all of you can be involved in the planning stages of ESSA, which will probably, given how long it took us to get this reauthorization done, ESSA will probably be with us, could be with us for a number of years. So it's important to be involved at the very beginning. So the guide is intended to provide parent center staff and their partners that they work with an understanding of key provisions in ESSA. And I emphasize the word key because there's a lot of provisions in ESSA, and we have pared it down for you so that we're in an attempt to help you focus on the things that we think are most important and most critical for equity for kids with disabilities. and we also are particularly concerned with you being meaningfully involved in how the states are planning to implement ESSA. And the guide is packed with action items that we have developed that we hope will help you navigate through this system. The one thing that I really want to emphasize to you today is that the clock is ticking here. We have to, make sure that we're right now working on getting involved in the planning process. States have already begun to develop and publish their draft consolidated state plans in an effort to meet the 2017 submission deadline of either April 3rd or September 18th. Now these deadlines, these submission deadlines were actually moved out as part of the regulatory process. So states have been given a little more time to get their plans together and to meet these submission dates. However, the states have been asked to inform the U.S. Department of Education by January 10th of this year of their planned submission date. So your state should be telling the U.S. Department of Ed whether they plan to submit their ESSA plan on either April 3rd or September 18th. And since they have to let the U.S. Department of Education know, they should also let their stakeholders in the state know of their submission date. Now, states have to allow for at least 30 days for the public to comment on their plan before they submit it to the U.S. Department of Education for its review and approval. But I would like to emphasize that you don't want to wait until this phase of planning and implementation to get involved. And in fact, there's no obligation that the state, come back to the public after that comment period and give you any kind of review of what they received. They do have to make a case to the U.S. Department of Education that they did the public comment period and that they made an effort to act on those comments. But it will be much too late for you to get involved at that stage of the game. So to help facilitate your involvement, I've given you 3 resources here where you can get information on what's happening with ESSA in your state. I think all states now have some ESSA web page or section on their State Department of Education, but these resources have in fact also highlighted whether the state has actually posted some kind of a draft plan. So there's 3 there. The Center for Standards and Assessment Implementation just put out their tracking document a couple of weeks ago. There's a website called understandingessa.org, which is entirely devoted to tracking activity in the states. So you just go there and click on your state, and it'll tell you what's happening. And then the National PTA has also been attempting to do a real fine job at keeping track of what's going on in each state. So if you go to their website and search ESSA web pages by state, you'll pull up their contribution to that. Now, let's talk for a minute about the stakeholder engagement requirement in ESSA. In developing state plans, the states must engage in timely and meaningful consultation with stakeholders. And I have to emphasize to you that Congress wasn't messing around when they embedded this stakeholder engagement language into the statute. They are quite serious that states take this in stakeholder engagement provision and requirement very seriously. So, and the stakeholders must reflect the geographic diversity of the state and include a broad range of individuals. And there's a long list of them in the stakeholder guide, but I've just pulled out 2 here that would be important to you, one being parents and families and the other being civil rights organizations, including those representing students with disabilities, English learners, and other historically underserved students. We have already seen, unfortunately, activities within states that they claim represent their stakeholder engagement activities where there is no representation of people who would be working on behalf of students with disabilities. So this is a particularly important requirement to get in front of and to make sure that if it's not happening in your state, that you let your state know about it. We also want to be clear that timely and meaningful consultation does not mean things like holding listening sessions or forums. These are activities that a lot of states have been engaging in through the fall months, or inviting comments to some document that they have put out via some web-based survey or other mechanisms, or just generally providing the public with the opportunity to comment. We don't consider this timely and meaningful, and you should not either. The other reason that it's essential for you to become involved at this point in the process is because once your state submits its plan, which will go through peer review, and is approved by the U.S. Department of Education, it can remain in effect for many years because the only requirement for a state to resubmit is when they're looking to make significant changes to the plan. So it's, here again, critical that we, at this moment in time, make sure that we are ensuring equity for students with disabilities in this stage. So a couple of quick things about what you'll find in the guide. You'll find a background of the law and the relationship between ESSA and the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. I know that you often get questions from parents about, well, my kid's covered under IDEA. Why does this other stuff matter? Well, we've tried to make that connection there for you. There's a sample implementation timeline with key activities along the way. There's an overview of the state plan requirement by ESSA, including several elements important to promoting improved achievement and providing equity for students with disabilities. The stakeholder engagement requirements spelled out in more detail than what I've just gone through with you here. And discussions of these important components of the state plan and the implications for each one of these for students with disabilities. As I indicated earlier, there are numerous requirements for the state plan to cover, but we have pulled out what we think are the most important pieces for you to focus on, and then we have given you an explanation of why it's important for kids with disabilities, and how you might, review what your state is proposing and ensure equity for kids with disabilities. And then there's also a list of additional resources. And I think as you can download this guide to the guide, which is in that little box underneath where it says File 34. A two-page PDF that SIPR has put together very nicely that will give you the links to all of the sections of the guide. The guide is only presented online, and you'll have quick links to hop to all of the sections. So that's it for me, and Deborah.
Thank you so much, Candace, and I also want to thank you for all of the work that you have done, and not only helping us to get started by drafting the guide, but also helping us to usher it through our review processes at OSEP, and really helping us to get something for parent centers that was really going to help them to be deeply involved in this work over these next months. So there are a couple of questions in the box. One is from Tammy, and it asks, will there be a reporting process required for the state on the timely and meaningful consultation under ESSA?
Yes, the state plan requires that the state lay out for the U.S. Department of Education how it went about, the stakeholder involvement. But here again, I can tell you that we've been reviewing draft state plans that have been posted for. We've reviewed 9 at this point. I think I sent all those analyses to Deborah, and I think she's going to post them for you in your private discussion space. And I think if you are in one of those states that has already released a draft plan, and we have reviewed it and commented on it, then I have emailed the executive director those comments, and we've also shared them with the PNAs and other disability advocacy organizations in the state. So you will see that, from time to time, there's a lengthy explanation, and there's lots of documents that lay out who who comprised these stakeholder groups that they put together. A lot of states have put together several different teams, and each team worked on a different issue, and there are all kinds of configurations that the states are engaging in. But the primary piece for us here is that we find over and over and over again that the majority of these stakeholders who are being engaged in this process are school folks, and there's very little representation of any of the groups of children for whom ESSA is intended to assist, all of those who historically underperform. And the purpose of the Act is to close achievement gaps. That's the purpose. And we start the guide with that statement of that purpose. So if you are not engaging the disability community, the NAACP, the Hispanic organizations, then you are not going to reach the children for whom the statute is intended to assist. So that's a long answer to that question.
Thanks, Candace. There's another question from Lauren, who's a Parent Center person who's also involved with NAMI National, and
right.
She's would like to have some clarification on how states will report reductions in the use of aversive behavioral interventions under ESSA.
Okay, well, there is a requirement, again, one of many, many, many requirements that the state address in their plan how they will go about addressing the use of aversive behavioral interventions. And this is language that essentially means restraint and seclusion. We weren't able to get that language in the statute, but we got this language, and the report language carried that interpretation. So there is no debate about what we're talking about here. But here again, there's no reporting, there's no data reporting attached to this. So you'll still have to rely primarily on the civil rights data collection for that type of information. And here again, we have reviewed state plans where this requirement was not addressed at all, or given quite short shrift in that, they say, oh, well, we're going to do PBIS, and that's going to be it. So there is, I would like to say, and I hope, Deborah, will put this in the space, there is a template that states are required to use to submit their plan. Here again, we have found that a lot of states aren't using the template, and by not using the template, it makes it very hard for you to pick out where the omissions of the plan. And we've spent a lot of time in our reviews pointing out the omissions, what's not in the plan, where compared to a state like, I'll give Maryland a shout out here because they did use the template, and it was very easy to review and compile our comments on their plan because it followed the template. It was very clear where they were not addressing the question directly. In a lot of cases, states are putting in placeholders on very important pieces of information like their minimum subgroup size, and you can see that if they're using the template. So.
Great, thank you. So what we'll do is we will include that template in the resource page for this webinar, and also link it into the guide so that it'll be easy for people to access. Thank you for pointing that out, because that will be really important. And I'm actually going to post it right now in the chat in case people are very curious and don't want to wait until they wade through the guide or until they get a chance to visit the workspaces.
And I will give states the benefit of the doubt here, because the template is relatively new. The template was put out at the time that the department released final regulations, so it hasn't it hasn't been available from the beginning. So some states who started their planning in the early fall didn't have the template didn't exist. So we'll give them a break, but they're going to have to use the template for their formal submission. So.
Great. So we do have a question from Kelly, and Kelly is with one of the CPRCs, and she asked a question about that she would like either Candace and or Cheryl to address, and that is the historically underserved populations and how that is addressed in terms of reporting requirements and or engagement. And as you know, our community parent resource centers, their primary focus is on historically underserved populations. And so this is a great question I'm sure many are interested in getting some feedback on.
There are reporting requirements for, as far as the assessment, the participation proficiency, that it be reported by subgroups, and the subgroups include what race, ethnicity, students with disabilities, English learners, there's a few others, migrant status, but they are required to report by subgroup. This is going back to the way it was under No Child Left Behind. Some states were doing some things differently with supergroups during the years of the waivers, but they are required to report by subgroup.
So I would just add to that there actually are two different pillars here within ESSA that we need to distinguish, okay? And one is reporting, and there's tons of reporting requirements, particularly, and they are delineated in the requirements that are laid out for the annual state report card, and that's part of the guide. But there's a much more important requirement, and that is the requirement for these individual populations to be broken out in your accountability system. And the accountability system is what triggers the identification of schools as in need of improvement. There are two different levels of improvement in ESSA, and we talk a lot about that in the guide and how you need to understand and impact those accountability pieces so that we're getting equity here. And Cheryl's comment about the use of super subgroups, which some states got away with under the waivers, and of course the waivers are now null and void. But some states are continuing to roll those pieces into their draft accountability plans under ESSA, and that's not allowed. That's not permitted. the Congress was very clear that they understood that combining subgroups of students was masking a lot of underachievement, and they took a stand on that. So I have, in the comments that I have sent those of you who we commented on, I pointed this out, that that they can't do this anymore.
Great. Thanks very much for that, too. And Vicki Farnsworth, who's at the military PTAC, also, she pointed out that military-connected students are also students who are included in those historically underserved populations. So we're coming close to our timeline. Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yes.
They're reported,
so we're coming
but
close
they're not
to
part of the accountability system.
Right.
Just a distinction.
So we're coming close to our timeline, but we do want to hear from you. And so we have a poll asking, has your Parent Center been involved in your ESSA plan development? And we'd like to get your response in terms of the level of involvement. Yes, you've been involved, and meaningfully. Yes, you've been involved, but not as meaningfully. Or no, we have not been included in any of the state activities in this area. So we'll just take another minute or so to gather responses. And while we're doing that, Heather points out that there is a great need for the individual populations to be identified. Within our military communities, there is a huge impact on some state systems, and that the concerns are real. And I know one of the things that our military TA center has been doing is helping those states, the PTIs in those states where there are the large military communities, to really be connected with those communities and helping to support those, to support families, but also to be advocates at the state and systemic levels to make sure that the students' needs are addressed through the, Heather remind me of what it's called, but it's some kind of through the compact. Mm-hmm. She further points out that military children also are being involved in ESSA systems that require support, and those are also in Department of Defense schools, and that the Department of Defense doesn't really have requirements for ESSA.
Right.
And then when they leave that school and go to a a regular public school, then they are all of a sudden required to be included, or they're addressed in terms of ESSA. So, some of the inconsistencies that happen that really can negatively impact their educational development. So we do have the polling in, and it looks like over 40% have not been included. We hope that the resources that we are sharing with you are going to help you to move to those tables and get involved. Anna Maria, if we can close the poll, then we have some. Our final page is just pointing you to the ESSA resources at the Hub. Lisa, do you want to guide us through real quick? Lisa Cooper is muted.
Came out last year at this time, right after the law was reauthorized, and it's been updated, but in case there are always new things coming out, you can search the Hub to see whether or not resources have been included in the repository. And then there's the first webinar on ESSA, which came 2 months after it was reauthorized, and then there's this one, and you can see the links there. And coming very soon are 2 fact sheets on assessments, academic assessment of students with disabilities, and then alternate assessments. And we'll let you know when those come out. It should be any day now. That's it.
Great, thanks so much. And if you have, this is also pointing you to where you can find the Stakeholders Guide. And that link, again, you can find the actual guide to the guide in the Files pod at the bottom of the page. And finally, we want to thank each of you for joining us this afternoon. We wish you a happy, healthy new year, and we're looking